Welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and today I'll be playing Scorn while uh, my computer dies. Anthony, how are you doing today? We should be. So it's nah. I'm just gonna reset the game. Good, 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 good. Fair enough. So I'm gonna turn some of these things off. Uh, Exit all apps. There we go. Basically, Scorn was one of those games that people considered kind of vaporware, where essentially, um, why is it updating like this? Where essentially, how do I want to put it? Like no one ever expected it to come out, and it did, which is nice. It's this huge biopunk HR Geiger uh, kind of nightmare where you're going through either a ship or a landscape that is absolutely infected with something that wants to just be left alone. And by that, I mean it wants you to stay away. Uh, it's mostly a puzzle game, mixed reviews, but it's one of those things where I've been following it for absolute years. Like we're talking, um, like when was the first bit of it out? Like a very long time ago. Scorn. We released like one video, and then we released two or three. It wasn't as good as Atomic Heart looking, which is Russian Bioshock. Um, and I'm kind of looking forward to that one too. But I wanted to support the creator just because art like this is hard to make, and it's important to do that stuff. To support them. Fair.
Obviously not difficult games, but I am also very bad at video games, so you know, it all evens out. Uh my impression of BioShock 2, the only thing that I knew about it is that I recall Yahtzee doing a review of it. Now, Yahtzee is somebody, real name Ben Croshaw, is one of the only video game critics that I actually respect in the modern day, who's like technically part of the mainstream. Because just like you get the impression reading his reviews, and I really do believe this, that he does not consider himself like beholden to the games industry.
Yep.
And Escapist talks about sometimes that they've like turned people have turned down reviews because they didn't like Yahtzee's tone, and like he actually had to like make a deal. He did start doing like a column for Escapist, and like he actually made a deal with them. It's like one of the conditions is that I don't need to moderate my language, and they agreed. And not that bad language is in itself like a marker of quality or honesty, but just the general attitude of like I refuse to moderate myself for the tastes of the mainstream is something I can appreciate. So while I do not always agree with him, I do appreciate him, and I think that's one of the reasons he's remained relevant for much, much longer than most game critics do.
Yep.
Like, most game critics have a very short shelf life, and correctly so. And his review of Bioshock, I always remember because I remember it being very funny. He started off by going like, just going like most sequels fall into a certain trap where they're like the same as the previous game and there's not enough difference, or they're lazy derivative rehashes. Goes, but Bioshock was a very experimental take in its storytelling on what the point of choice in video games is, and Bioshock 2, in fact, questions the very idea of a sequel, then cuts himself off and goes, I'm just kidding, it's a knockoff piece of shit. And then he just goes into, like, why he hated the game. That was all I knew of Bioshock.
Yeah.
That whole preface is to say, of Bioshock 2, I mean. And I just kind of didn't really have any interest in the game for a long time, because I'm like, well, if it's just Bioshock 1, but more and not as good, like, I'll just play Bioshock 1 again. But there seems to have been, like, a bit of a critical reappraisal as the years have gone on, and especially as people sort of realize that Bioshock Infinite actually wasn't that good. So people start kind of looking back at Bioshock 2 and going, like, in a lot of ways, it was actually a pretty good game. And not Yahtzee. Yahtzee is a notoriously harsh critic.
Yeah.
So he hasn't, like, revisited it or anything. But, like, other people I've seen some people praising the story of Bioshock 2 as being underrated. Uh, the important thing that we have to remember when we talk about these games and their stories and going, oh man, the story is so good, is that the story of Bioshock and Bioshock 2 are not very good. What we actually mean is they are very good for a video game. But if you tell these, like, I want you to do an experiment, and I've done this experiment before. Attempt to tell the story to somebody who is, like, moderately educated, like, who you respect for their intelligence, right? But
Yeah.
who doesn't really know anything about video games or education, or not education, video games or video game storytelling, right? I once did this with my college myth and culture professor. Was telling her about who was somebody who I respected. She was an intelligent person, and I was telling her about Bioshock. And when I got to the point that the villain was named Andrew Ryan, she burst out laughing. So, at the subtlety of it.
Yes, absolutely. Very subtle.
Yeah, so and it was at that moment that I realized maybe the story in BioShock is not as clever as I thought it was. Now, this is not entirely fair because one of the things that makes BioShock clever is that it makes use of the fact that it's a video game, and this is why on our stream about video game storytelling, I put a high emphasis on that in terms of like what makes a good story in a video game. Well, it needs to make use of the fact that it's a video game in some way to tell its story. BioShock does. With that said, the story surrounding it, stripped from like the video game, the fact that it's in a video game, is incredibly unsubtle and incredibly on the nose.
Yeah.
And as Randians will be very quick to tell you, now I cannot confirm because I have not read and have no interest in reading Ayn Rand in real life, but Randians will be very quick to tell you that's not even really an accurate portrayal of Ayn Rand's philosophy, and I will take their word for it. Ken Levine does not strike me as a sort of person who is going to be fair in his philosophical critiques.
Nope.
So,
Not one
I'm
bit.
sure, yeah, I'm sure it's not a very accurate portrayal of Ayn Rand, just as I'm sure, for that matter, that Sophia Lamb is not a very accurate portrayal of radical communism. Uh, both of them are just an excuse to be totalitarian. And just like Zachary Comstock in Infinite is not a very good portrayal of theocracy.
Yep.
So, what is the moral to all of this? Not much of one. This is a very stream of consciousness type stream. You know.
Yeah.
Bringing up horror video games, though, it's a good discussion point for the day before Halloween, I think. Have you played Bioshock 2?
Yes, I enjoyed it very much.
The one thing that I've heard, and that I'm not far enough in yet, so can't confirm, is that the gameplay of Bioshock 2 is better than the gameplay of Bioshock 1.
Yes, that is absolutely true.
I can believe that. I actually really liked the gameplay of Bioshock 1. I had a lot of fun with it, but
It's so it's
go
like
ahead.
it's about the feeling of it. Like in this game that I'm playing, Scorn, the idea is basically a bit of powerlessness. I should probably see if that door opens. And like you're not really supposed to be shooting and fighting, being the big daddy, and so on and so forth. But let's see. What was no? Well, anyway, so like they had this one scene at the end of Bioshock One where you become the Big Daddy, which honestly was dumb. I didn't like it. It kind of ruined it for me. Like if the game stopped at you beating Andrew Ryan to death, that would have been a fantastic ending.
It's an amazing moment, and it's one of those things where I've seen people like try and criticize it in retrospect, and it's not something, like that retrospective criticism isn't something I take seriously because I played that game without being spoiled. I did not know the twist when I played it,
Yep.
and the twist got me like when it happened. So like I can confirm, like as somebody who played it with no prior knowledge, that as a storytelling moment it was really effective. Like I was floored at the time. So like people will try and say like, oh, it doesn't really work for this reason or that reason. I'm like, no dude, it worked. Like it worked really well.
Yep.
But everything after that point kind of didn't work.
And I think that's something a lot of people kind of don't get about storytelling. Sometimes things don't work, and that's a very true statement. But there are other times where it does work, and it works pretty much every time. Like even though I'm a very jaded kind of guy, and I came in spoiled to Bioshock, I still had that moment of horror where I, clicked the button to beat Andrew Ryan to death with his own golf club.
Oh,
As he
I
as he
had what
hold
I
on,
would
like,
imagine. Oh, I'm
but
sorry. Go
like
ahead. I didn't
like
mean to cut you off.
it's more than just the pieces of it, right? It's not the how do I want to put it? It's not the little bits here and there. It is the whole picture. You're going through all this. You get the revelation that's been hinted at for a very long time through audio recordings, and you kind of get this feeling that okay, something's not right about me, the player character, and they hit it right where you are pretty involved with your own player character, um, through all the different things like with Cohen and other people, where you're pretty
Yep.
much connected in all directly. And then you walk through, and it's a room full of crazy, and you see him, golfing and stuff like that. And then he forces you to kill him, while every time you hit him, he goes, "A man chooses, a slave obeys," until he's dead. Like, and it's a gross, visceral death. Like it
Mm.
hits all the points, and I think people miss out on that. Like they're like, oh well, it's just this. No, it's the whole visceral experience. Part about being a video game is sure clicking the button to do the thing, but it's clicking the button to do the thing thematically, with all the pieces working towards a point for a climax that everyone remembers, no matter how much they complain about it. Like it's Bioshock is a masterpiece for a reason, and even though its successors aren't as dramatic as these, there is a definite reason that Ken Levine got work after Bioshock.
See, when I played the original BioShock, I had what I would imagine the developers would consider to be like the ideal experience for that particular moment. Like you, like I was playing it and you're at that point of the game, you've realized that there's something that is off, but you don't know what, right? And there's all of these various things and you're getting these flashbacks, and then you start seeing the "would you kindly" on the walls as you're walking
Yep.
in. And ideally, and like I said, like I was the ideal player at this point of the game, I'm thinking to myself, like, all the times that "would you kindly" has been said to me, and then I'm thinking of, like, what I've listened to in the audio recordings and how, people are controlled and things like that. And then it clicks in my head right about the moment that Andrew Ryan starts speaking. So you get this moment of horror as you start going, like, as you start putting the pieces together right as the game is revealing it to you. It is a perfectly executed twist
Yep.
because they set up the pieces to solve it precisely at the moment where they want you to solve it. Now, I am sure that a particularly clever player could have probably figured it out first, but like just going by reviews of the game and at the time, I don't think that was the normal experience. I think that most people who played that game for the first time without being spoiled experienced it roughly the way that I did, which
Yep.
is start to work it out at the same moment that the game tells you. And then you just have this moment of dawning horror as you realize that everything that's gone on up to this point has been a total lie, but also they set it up perfectly and it all makes perfect sense.
Yep.
It's a very cleverly done moment. And so this is, on the bright side, right? Like on the positive side for BioShock, in terms of nuts and bolts storytelling, it's very well done. Uh, with that said, the theming of BioShock is incredibly unsubtle, and I doubt it is presenting the philosophy of Ayn Rand in any sort of fair, balanced way. Not that I would care to figure it out, since I do not care about Ayn Rand at all whatsoever. I consider her to be more or less irrelevant to modern society. Her effect has been to make libertarians like not shower or something. Uh, I
It's
don't know.
more so it's more like libertarians tend to be of the mammon mob, sort of Satanist variety. They pursue um, they pursue their own good above all other things, and then try to make a political movement out of selfishness, which doesn't doesn't work in a word. Um, there's no reason for it to work in any way, shape, or form. Uh, but essentially, like, it's important because it's like the ultimate non-Christian, very specific, right-wing fantasy um, for for individualists, but it's nothing. It just doesn't work, is what I'm trying to say. Uh, because one, any collectivist organization can beat a non-collectivist organization stupid. Um, two, it doesn't have any heart or soul or religious aspects of it. It doesn't have Christ essentially. Uh, and three, it's just weak. It's just something whose only morality is I am the ultimate good. Is just a weak existence.
Uh, hmm. Okay. I mean, yeah. I don't know. See, the thing about Ken Levine is that, who, by the way, that's for people who are listening, since we've referenced him a couple times, that's the Bioshock guy. He was originally involved in System Shock. Bioshock is historically understood as like a loose remake of System Shock 2, where they weren't even really trying to hide it, hence reusing the name and all of that. Infamously, for example, the plot twist at the end of at the midpoint, I guess I should say, or the three-quarter mark of Bioshock, is the same plot twist that is used in System Shock 2. So, did you know that, by the way?
Uh, what's the twist?
So, in System Shock 2, the twist is, in essence, exactly the same as the Andrew Ryan twist in Bioshock. you are getting led around the ship by, and don't get me wrong, there are differences in like specifics and the way that it's done, and in theming as well. But in System Shock 2, the twist is that you're being led around the ship trying to figure out what's going on. There's been some sort of disaster on a spaceship that's mutated people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, blah blah splicers. And you have powers that are very similar to plasmids, but in System Shock 2, they're like psionics, you know. And then there is a reveal 3/4 of the way into the game that the AI voice that's been guiding you around is actually the evil supercomputer Shodan, and that in reality, like, she has been leading you on a way to like restore her to power or something, and that the narrator is not actually in any danger and doesn't need to be helped, but was really just Shodan imitating someone else. So that same basic idea of the narrator who has been leading you around the whole time is actually the villain. They repurposed for BioShock, but changed it thematically and the mechanics of how it worked so that it fit the theme of BioShock better. And I think they did. I mean, I think history shows pretty much, you know, in how people reacted to it. They did a very successful job of rebranding and retheming it, but the basic idea was basically the same. One
Mm.
of the problems with System Shock 2 was that the twist was a lot more telegraphed than it was in BioShock because Shodan was used in all of the advertising for the game. So everybody knew she'd be showing up at one point, so I don't think it was as surprising. And yet, people who, you know, have played that game without being spoiled on it seem to remember the twist pretty fondly, so who knows. I have tried playing System Shock 2 before. I gave up very quickly because I found the uh, the battle system, I don't know what you would call it, combat system, incredibly convoluted. And I've heard people say, like, oh, that's because, you know, modern gamers can't handle any sort of complexity. They need everything dumbed down for them. And I would counter with the fact that this was a critique of System Shock 2 by games companies at the time. So I really do not think that is true. I think it's just a convoluted mess of a game. Uh, But, you know, I understand why it had such a hardcore fan base. Atmospherically, it's very, very strong. It's definitely a scary game to play at night. I did try playing System Shock 1 once, and it is like several levels above convoluted to the point where it is basically impossible to figure out what's going on and what's happening at any given moment. Uh, for at the very least, I found it that way because I am a modern gamer and I am very much not used to the way that System Shock plays. So the game is not for me. But
It's
my point being that
the,
Ken Levine, go ahead.
there's
Sorry.
differences in generation on a lot of video games, but a lot of it comes down to, you know, sort of patience and a willingness to accept jank, which honestly most people rightly aren't as conditioned to accept these days as they have in the past, um, which I'm okay with, surprisingly. A lot of the old stuff in video games were made because of how um, difficult it was to make a game back when you only had 32 colors to work with. Um,
Yep.
yeah.
I mean, as far as Ken Levine goes, like, I don't think that Ken Levine is nearly as much of a genius as everybody thinks he is. For one thing, again, Bioshock itself is, like, generally understood as, and I think correctly, a loose remake of System Shock 2.
Yeah.
And from what I understand of System Shock 2 and what I understand of Bioshock, I think that understanding is more or less accurate. So he made the same game twice, but with updated graphics and putting a new spin on the theming. And don't get me wrong, he did a good job with it. And some of the levels in the original Bioshock are amazing. Ken Levine famously was not involved in Bioshock 2, so I cannot really. That has nothing to do with the discussion here nor there. Uh, but Bioshock Infinite was an absolute mess to make, and when it came out, was definitely It was not an awful game by any means. Like, the mechanics worked, but it was definitely not what he seemed to have originally intended. And I am still going to contend that the story of Bioshock Infinite was very, very poor. Uh,
Yeah.
with that said, the Burial at Sea Part 2 DLC, where you have to play as Elizabeth and it turns into a stealth game, is a lot of fun. It's not very difficult, but it's a lot of fun. And is arguably the best part of Bioshock Infinite.
Yes.
Have you ever played the either of the Burial at Sea DLCs?
I bought like day one. Bioshock Infinite like day one, my dude. I'm down. I am down to clown.
Didn't the DLCs come out much later?
Yep.
I I played the Burial at Sea Part 1, had fun with it. It was all right. It was just more BioShock Infinite except they stuck it in Rapture, which fine, Rapture's a cool setting. But Burial at Sea Part 2 was, kind of a throwback to Thief. And I have tried to play Thief many, many times and never got into it. Every time I played it, just never really gelled with the mechanics of Thief. But I really did enjoy the Burial at Sea Part 2. Now, Bioshock Infinite, though, what's more interesting about Bioshock Infinite is not the game that we got, which was a more or less average shooter with a cool setting. And that's pretty much everything that I can, that's the most you could recommend about it. Has its flaws, but ultimately, like, it works as a shooter. And the setting is great. And the acting is great. The voice acting of Elizabeth and Booker is very good. Uh, I will give it that for sure. But what's more interesting to me is the game that we were promised to get. The hype for Bioshock Infinite before it came out was massive, and the trailers and clips that we got of the game were for a very different game than we actually ended up getting. Like, there was, I recall, implied to be some sort of magic system involving Elizabeth that never actually made it into the finished product. Like, I vividly remember a trailer of the
Yes.
game where Elizabeth like brings a horse back to life or something.
Basically, there's a lot more to it than that, but yeah, like the hype for the Elizabeth mechanics was out was absolutely immense. But the thing is that they couldn't deliver really compared to what they said, and that's something that comes through a lot in a lot of video games where okay. I'm starting to get the vibe of this place, where basically developers will promise the moon, and then just not be able to deliver it in any sort of time frame, if at all. Um, like a lot of things, like with this one, there was supposed to be a whole lot of non-linear storytelling, blah blah blah. Scorn, that is. But when it comes down to it, probably the first area is open ended, maybe the second, but then the rest is going to be very railroaded.
See, this is a thing with Ken Levine though. Like, for example, supposedly after BioShock Infinite, he was going to like strip down the studio, then work on his next game, and like he did. He basically fired everyone, kept a small team intact, like renamed the studio, and then was like, "Yeah, we're gonna focus everything on this next game," and then we've gotten nothing, like at almost radio silence.
Yep.
Like, I don't even think there is a concept for the next game out. I don't know if he's even done anything at all with it. Uh,
There's always a rumor or two, and he does art projects every now and then.
the thing about Ken Levine is I think BioShock Infinite sort of broke the spell he had with a lot of people. Like, I think that people thought that Ken Levine was some sort of auteur,
Mm.
in the video game industry. And after BioShock Infinite, everybody was like, "Hey, wait a minute, that wasn't that great." Like, You
I
know,
mean, he's still technically an auteur. He's just not as good as everyone says he was, which is a common issue that comes up.
I mean, I know that. So I've never played any Kojima games. I know that Metal Gear Solid is this big long running franchise, but Brian Niemeyer recently wrote about him, and he's basically like, you know, he didn't say it in as many words, but like Kojima's a fraud.
Mm, I've never really agreed with that. I know Razorfist doesn't like him, and a few other people don't like him, which is fine. Uh, it's not to be expected. Man, I have no idea where I'm doing, what I'm doing, or where I'm going. But dang. But basically, Kojima writes a lot of checks he um, can't always deliver
Yeah,
on. But
yeah.
the thing is, though, is that he still has bigger and better video games than any other auteur that has a right to be. Um, like, people can say all they want about him, but quite frankly, he has delivered. And quite a bit more than to be expected from somebody who has his reputation. Um,
I gotcha.
and that's
See,
a difference. Like, auteurship works if the guy can deliver. If he can't deliver, like say Ken Levine, then it's absolutely wasted on him, and he'll be revealed as a fraud eventually. Whereas
see
Kojima,
George Lucas.
yep, George Lucas and others. And the thing about them, you sound like you're dying. Like this guy's breathing in
Very bad allergies.
like toxic
Get
spores.
post-nasal drip into my throat, and then I start coughing up phlegm. It's quite
Ooh.
gross.
All right, I don't think I'm supposed to be here yet. I'm going back. Well, I'm going to press the button and then I'm going to go back. What gets me about it though is that people kind of misunderstand it. Like there's a certain amount of demand for perfection that I just don't think. I guess it's not ready yet. I just don't think exists. Like if Ken Levine had what? You can look at yourself. If Ken Levine had delivered on Bioshock Infinite, no one would be doubting it, even with the same story that's provided. As weird as
So,
it is
if
to
the
say,
game itself was better, yes.
if the game itself was better, and that's the standard that we judge video games by. The gag is that Kojima likes to write movies, not games, but somebody on his team that he trusts with everything he is making the games fun for people to play. I played them. I've spent 100 odd hours on Metal Gear Solid 5. Like there's. I even played the post ending content. Like you don't just do that for a game that's terrible. You know what I mean?
Yep, I get you. So, yeah, I can't comment directly on Kojima because I just haven't played any of his games. And for no real reason except they've never seemed particularly interesting to my personal style of play. Like maybe I will one day, maybe not. But I'm sure I understand that he has a fan base. So I'm gonna comment here, and I promise you this is related. It all loops around. It's all connected. You got to imagine one of those big boards where there are strings everywhere, and you got a
Mm,
guy with crazy hair pointing at the board.
let's just
You know what
believe
I'm
it.
talking about. Uh, the what's it called? The Spielberg movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. That's it. The Close Encounters board. So Pokemon.
Mm-hmm.
Ho, I know. Uh,
It was only a matter of time.
At least I didn't bring up Sly Cooper, and I thought about it. No. There's there actually is like a new Pokemon game coming out in 2 weeks, so it is fairly relevant for the time. But anyway, in all seriousness, if you go back to the origins of Pokemon, you connect it to now. There are some interesting parallels here, and I'll explain what I mean. So, when you look at how Pokemon started, Game Freak was a company that was like working on third-party games for a long time, and their dream was to make an RPG. Now, the RPG that they had in mind was based around Earthbound. They were all really big fans of the RPG Earthbound. Have you heard of Earthbound?
Yes.
There you go. So, they were all really big fans of Earthbound. They wanted to do like Earthbound for kids type thing. And famously, one of the creators had a hobby of catching bugs. So he had this idea of turning that like bug catching hobby into something that kids who lived in cities could play.
Mm.
So the whole idea behind Pokemon initially was that you collect these cool little monsters and they become the customization in your RPG, right?
Right.
Now, when Game Freak originally created the Pokemon series, Generation 1, Pokemon is famously divided into generations. We are now coming up on Generation 9. But when they originally created Generation 1, they were not the Pokemon company at the time. I mean, they literally weren't. Now there is the Pokemon company. There was not at the time. There was Nintendo, there was Game Freak, and there was Creatures Inc. Game Freak were the people who were actually making the games, and still are to this day. So, at the time of when Pokemon was first being made, they were still working on third-party stuff. They were not trusted to make this game. As a result, they had like a very small staff and a very tight budget. And the Generation 1 Pokemon games are somewhat unfairly, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, maligned for being an incredibly buggy mess of a game, but they were a much bigger hit than everybody expected that they would be. Now, they did think the games would be a hit. They thought they would be a big enough hit that they were already marketing like the anime and stuffed animals and things like that around it.
Mm-hmm.
But, there's a certain level of hit where it's literally impossible to predict, right? You
Right.
could predict that Pokemon will be a hit, but you can't predict it will be literally the most popular thing ever invented, which is what it ended up being. That's a level that, like, nobody in their wildest dreams could possibly engineer in advance. That's Kismet.
Mm.
So, the Gen 1 Pokemon games come out, and it's not the game that they originally intended to make. As a matter of fact, although it is often criticized for being very badly programmed and very buggy, as one very, very good review that I'm going to recommend by their YouTube channel is called Tama Hero, Tama space Hero. Uh, their very good review of the games pointed out that all Game Boy games in this era of video gaming were incredibly buggy. And in fact, the Pokemon Company, considering the resources they had, should be commended for creating games that actually worked. The truth is, if you played Generation 1 Pokemon as I did, most of the time, if you were a kid playing the game, you really would not interact with most of the bugs. It was a game that ran. It
Mm-hmm.
ran the way it was supposed to run. And even when it didn't run the way it was supposed to run, those mistakes were mistakes that were hidden from the player most of the time. Like,
Yep.
I only learned that they were very buggy games years and years later, looking back at them, and then I learned that there were all these bugs you could interact with, but I didn't know it at the time.
Right.
I just played the games. So, Gen 1 comes out, it's a much bigger hit, and now Game Freak is allowed to create the game that they want to play, or that they've always wanted to make, and this is where you get Generation 2. Now, this all connects, I promise, and it's going to connect when I get there. It's like the Incredibles meme where they go, but how are you getting to authorship in video games? And then Mr. Incredible yells, "We get there when we get there." Uh, that's where I'm going with this. So, Generation 2, though, actually does connect directly to this, because the Generation 2 Pokemon games are, in many ways, the only pure Pokemon games ever invented. And what I mean by that is, at the time that the Gen 2 games were made, there was no guarantee of a Generation 3. Like, so the Gen 2 games, unlike other later games in the Pokemon series, really were almost sequels slash remakes to Generation 1. You revisit the first region, for example, in the second half of the game. You could actually go back to the region that was from the first game. No other games allow you to do this except for remakes of the Generation 2 games. Uh, and generally, the Pokemon team deserves credit for now that they actually had the time to program the game. The Generation 2 games are pretty well made. There are bugs, but they're a lot harder to find and a lot harder to exploit. They're
Yep.
much better made games. I would argue, based on the massive improvements made, that you can say that they are probably some of the greatest sequels in video game history. Not necessarily in terms of, like, on the list of best games ever made, but in terms of best sequels ever made and realizing the potential in the original concept. The Gen 2 games, like, knock it out of the park. These were the games that Game Freak always wanted to make. So, how do they play? Well, the Gen 2 games are often criticized for having a very low level curve, and I think that this is, on one hand, a fair criticism, but on the other hand, it misunderstands how the games are supposed to be played. You are encouraged to take your time in Generation 2. Johto, the region, is small, and it has many ways of cutting through the region, many back routes and shortcuts and things like that.
Yep.
And what you can find in those different back routes and shortcuts will often change depending on the day of the week. So you're encouraged to take your time. Stick a Pokemon in the daycare, wait for them to breed. While you wait for them to breed, you could go on a Tuesday to the bug catching contest and try and win only on Tuesdays. And then on Wednesday, you could bring something to Kurt, the Apricorn Pokeball maker. Come back on a Thursday, and he'll have made you a new type of Pokeball. There will be Pokemon that are available in certain spots only on certain days of the week that you can find by exploring. And you're encouraged to look for different routes around Johto. There isn't just one way to get around, there are multiple ways to get around. There are hidden items that, if you interact with the game correctly, you can find. The whole idea behind the Generation 2 Pokemon games is that you are encouraged to take your time in the world, to explore it, to spend time with your team, to experiment with different Pokemon and things like that. So, by the time you reach the final battle at the end of the game, which is famous to this day as being the hardest battle in the mainline series, the battle against Red at the top of Mount Silver, the final the secret final boss of the second game,
Which always
there is
felt
generally
amazing.
going to be, what was that?
Which always felt amazing, no matter how powerful your team was.
Yep. Uh, the idea was that you would probably be underleveled by the time you reached him, and people would complain about this, but that was the point. Now, if there was a flaw in the Generation 2 games, then the main flaw is that Game Freak didn't do a very good job of teaching you how to play, because in theory, Red should be beatable even with an underleveled team. Like, Pokemon isn't that hard of a game, and you should be able, with the correct use of items and the proper team buildup and a correct use of moves, you should be able to beat Red even with a 20 to 25 level gap. You know, you have the pieces, they're there. But the game doesn't do a very good job of teaching you how to use these pieces, and I think that is a legitimate criticism that can be laid at its feet. But overall, like, as far as criticisms go, that is the largest criticism that I would lay at the feet of Generation 2. I think generally it is an outstanding game, uh, especially for kids. Now, why is all of this relevant? Well, the reason that I go into all of this and how the game is made and how it's supposed to work is that I think that that was Game Freak making the game that they really wanted to make. That was the dream. When they came up with Pokemon, this is what they had in mind as the game that Pokemon was intended to be. After that point, there were other good Pokemon games, some even great Pokemon games, some I would consider better than the Generation 2 games. Like, I think that the Generation 5 games are excellent. I think that the Generation 3 games are excellent. I think Pokemon Platinum is very, very good. Uh, And for that matter, I'm in the minority as I think that the Generation 7 games are really, really good games that people don't give enough credit. Uh, but I don't think that any of these games represented what Game Freak really intended Pokemon to be. I think that after Generation 2, when they made the game that they always wanted to make, they started to gear the games more towards being accessible to large groups of people. So they dialed back a bit on the RPG
You there?
to catch certain Pokemon. Gen 3 even gets rid of the day night cycle completely. Uh,
Wow.
and I think with some justification. You know, and
Yay.
the idea, my understanding of the reason that they got rid of it in Gen 3 was actually because, like, the color palette that they were utilizing made it look really bad. And I can believe this because I've seen fan remakes try and add a day-night cycle, and it always in the Gen 3 games, and they always look terrible. So I sort of get it.
Yeah.
Uh, and I also know that when they remade the Gen 3 games, they remade it with a day-night cycle. But the whole idea was that they were trying to make the games more accessible. In the Emerald version, they added the Battle Frontier, which is by far the best post-game content in any Pokemon game. It was basically like Pokemon Stadium, except that it was in the game and you didn't need to buy a new game to play it, which is amazing. And I think, honestly, like, legitimately, what I think happened is that after, like, Gen 5 or so, they realized that that was content that they could make people pay for, so they stopped putting it in the game because they realized that people would just pay for it separately, which is kind of crappy, but whatever. So recently, that same YouTuber I mentioned, Tamahiro, did a video on the game Pokemon Coliseum, and her video was that Pokemon Coliseum was actually terrible. And she explains that the reason that it was terrible was that it was made by a third party. It was not made by Game Freak. Instead, it was made by Nintendo. Uh, at the time, Game Freak, Nintendo, and Creatures Inc. were still working out the rights to, like, combine Pokemon into the Pokemon Company. So it was unclear who had the rights to do what, and Nintendo knew that Pokemon was their moneymaker and really, really wanted to get a Pokemon console game on the GameCube, which Game Freak refused to make because they said, first, we're working on our next actual mainline Pokemon game, and second, Pokemon is a handheld game. It's designed to be a handheld game. The whole point is that you could bring it around to trade with friends. So, like, we're not going to make a console Pokemon game. So Nintendo just said, okay, we'll make it then. And they did. Now, Tama's point in the video was that they really did not understand Pokemon at all. They got rid of wild Pokemon and catching and instead added a mechanic called Shadow Pokemon. And her entire point was that the whole mechanic of Shadow Pokemon, the elimination of wild Pokemon, meant that none of the mechanics were interacting correctly. Like, Shadow Pokemon made the whole game a massive grind. There was no real way to, like, build new teams. Like, everybody would be playing with the same team. You would not have a different team every time, right? Like, you would just have a team of Shadow Pokemon that you eventually purified of their Shadow form. So, because of this, there was no real team building element to it. Grinding was incredibly difficult because of the lack of wild Pokemon. Uh, Purifying Shadow Pokemon took an incredibly long time, and the game did not do very well. Like, it sold 2 million copies, which for a Pokemon game is incredibly low. And I think it's still, to this day, like, the worst selling Pokemon game of all time. Now, that isn't that bad in the end, and it did manage to get itself a sequel called XD Gale of Darkness. And she said, it is true that XD Gale of Darkness does fix all of the crippling flaws of Coliseum. The problem is, all this really meant was that XD Gale of Darkness was a very generic, bare bones Pokemon RPG. She's like, does it work? Well, sure, it works in the sense that the Pokemon formula is pretty good. You know, people enjoy playing it, and it's well designed to do what it's supposed to do. but it is not a particularly good Pokemon game. This was made by a third-party studio who made these games in order to make money. So, we fast forward to now, the modern era of Pokemon. Now, there has been a second Pokemania that was caused by Pokemon Go, and Sword and Shield came out and became the second best-selling Pokemon game of all time. They were actually a huge hit, despite the fact that they were very controversial when they came out for cutting a bunch of Pokemon out of the game. And they were controversial because they just weren't that great. Like, they weren't awful or anything, but certainly they were disappointing. But the fact remains that, number one, Game Freak supported them. And they really did, too. They would run events in the game. They would be giving out Pokemon. They added multiple DLCs. They added more Pokemon into the game. So by Game Freak supporting them, this allowed them to have a much longer shelf life than most Pokemon games tend to have. And number two, I think what makes this all relevant is that Pokemon's entering a similar era to that time around Gen 3, where they didn't really know where the series was going to go next. Now, we of course, in hindsight, know what happened, which is that people who knew the series continued making the games, and they managed to make a pretty good balance of making the games more accessible while keeping the core of what made the series fun. So Gen 3 and Gen 5 in particular are very, very well remembered. Gen 4 has Pokemon Platinum, which many consider to be the best Pokemon game of all, as well as the Gen 4 remakes, Heart Gold and Soul, or the Gen 2 remakes, Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which are excellent games. But now we're in a point where it's very similar to that era where who is going to be taking over the games? Are they going to be people who actually know how a Pokemon game works? Like, that was the problem with Colosseum, right? The problem with Colosseum was that when they made that game, the people who made it really did not know how how Pokemon was supposed to work. So they created a game that did not play into the series' strengths in any way at all. So you have that game, and now we're in the modern era, and there's this whole thing about, like, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, which is about to come out, is going to be open world. Now, on one hand, this is exciting because Pokemon is a series that I think pretty naturally lends itself to the concept of being open world. Like, you can imagine an open world Pokemon game very easily. On the other hand, is it going to... You do need to worry for a moment if it's going to be something like Colosseum, where the people who made the game are adding in these new mechanics without really considering whether or not they're interacting well with the mechanics that are already there. I am very wary of open world games generally. Most of the time, they do not work. This is a point that Yahtzee has made in his reviews. So the fact that the game is going to be open world is more a note of caution to me than a note of excitement. It could be good, but it could also be very, very bad. So we'll have to see what happens. All of this is to say that with these big franchises and things, I guess what I'm trying to get at is they don't really care. Like,
Yes.
Pokemon Company does not... all of these concerns that I just raised, the Pokemon Company cares about none of them.
Yeah, mostly.
Like, literally none. They care about one thing and one thing only. Will the game sell?
One of the first memes, like modern memes, was Shigeru Miyamoto holding up a Pikachu that is crapping money and and he's going, "It prints money."
That's pretty funny. Yeah, because the Pokemon Company, Nintendo, Game Freak, whatever, like, they don't care about how good the game is. They don't care about if they're pushing the industry forward. Now, I think the original Game Freak team, that's my point in all of this. I think they did care. Like, I think the original team had a genuine vision of what they wanted to make, and they accomplished that vision all the way back in Generation 2. Therefore, I think if you want the purest experience of what a Pokemon game was always meant to be by the developers, Game 2 and its remakes, which are also excellent games, uh, are where you're going to get it. That's not even to say that I think they're necessarily the best games in the series. I don't, but I think that they most represent what the developers always intended Pokemon to be. Like, this is when they came up with the idea for Pokemon, this is what they were imagining. The Gen 2 games. Uh Nowadays, what they want to do is make a game that sells. Sword and Shield was a very flawed game. It was flawed for a lot of reasons. They in one of the most bizarre interview decisions that I have ever seen, they claim that the reason that they had to cut out Pokemon is that they were redoing all of the models for Sword and Shield. But then a bunch of fans went into the models and like played with them to see if they had actually remade them, and as it turns out, they remade almost none of the models. So it was like, why did you say that then? And the answer is probably because they were doing hundreds of interviews, and the dude who was being interviewed was just trying to come up with like some sort of excuse to get people off their backs. Uh, the animation for the moves in Generation 7 in Sword and Shield is really bad. Some of the moves look good. Some of the moves are embarrassing, like double kick. They just have a little animation of a foot that pops up on the screen, and it honestly, like, it makes me cringe when I see it. The graphics are very poor. Now, are there moments of the game that look pretty okay? Yes, but generally they're poor. And then more fundamentally, in Sword and Shield specifically, the cities are very empty, and it's really weird. Pokemon is generally very good at populating its cities with people that make the cities feel like they have some level of personality. That's not to say that, it's deep or anything. It is a kid's game in the end. But there's personality there. Sword and Shield really didn't have that at all. The cities had a visual design, but they did not feel like they were lived in any sense of the word. It's just very, very strange.
I've seen pictures of that before. It's like the entire city is just like nothing. Like it's like a zombie apocalypse, completely empty. And it's like
Yeah, exactly.
who who agreed to this? Who as the editor, whatever the term is for this stuff, went, yeah, print. This is
Now,
exactly what we want.
yeah, exactly. And the thing about everything that I just said is that the Pokemon Company does not care at all because Sword and Shield printed money. Uh, it printed money.
Yep.
Now, there was enough of a backlash that I am hopeful for Scarlet and Violet. The pre-release stuff has made it look promising, and there certainly has not been as much negative press in advance of the release of these new games as there was before Sword and Shield. Everybody was wary of Sword and Shield before it came out. And for the record, I don't think that Sword and Shield were terrible games or anything, but the reason that they weren't terrible games is just because the Pokemon formula is pretty good.
Yep.
Like, if you just create the formula, then automatically the game is going to be fun on some level. In a weird way, Sword and Shield was honestly like a test case for just how good the basic Pokemon formula is. If you create a roster of new monsters that are fun and interesting, and credit to Sword and Shield, they did. Some of the Pokemon designs are really good in Sword and Shield. And you just populate the world with them and you put in a few battles that are, at least semi-engaging to get through. Like, they don't even need to be particularly hard. Just, you need to use different Pokemon to get through the game. Like, it's probably going to be a fun game. And that is exactly what it was. But at the same time, Sword and Shield was also like, okay, so that's all you need to do. Like, that's it. Now,
Yep. Now, they
I
already have that fan base, though.
Yes and no, though. See, they have that fan base, but Pokemon is smart enough to know that, like, the millennials, the people like me who are hardcore quote unquote fans, I mean, I don't really consider myself hardcore. I don't like. There are competitive players. There are people who have like all of this merchandise and whatever. I get the new games when they come out. You can call that what you want, but uh, semi hard. But like my generation is not where their money lies. Their money lies in kids, and they know this. Millennials have been begging for a Pokemon game that was based towards millennials, and in a sense, they kind of got that with Pokemon Legends Arceus. And Legends Arceus was a good game. But even Legends Arceus, like, I saw a review. I did not watch it, but I saw the title, and the title was good. Uh, a good game made badly. And that's exactly it. It's like Legends Arceus was really strange. It was a lot of really good game design decisions and an overall very good game, but it wasn't designed well. Like, or rather, it wasn't made well. The graphics were really weak. Like the NPCs uh didn't have any dialogue. They just had dialogue boxes pop up over their heads. Some of the animations in the game were really bad. And yet, the mechanics of Legends Arceus and the way that you interact with them were really fun. Now, it took place supposedly in the Sinnoh region. Sinnoh is considered to be there. That's the region that the Gen 4 games take place in. Sinnoh is considered by fans to be one of the best regions, if not the best region in the entire series. And rightly so. But if you play Legends Arceus, like all of the charm and fun is sucked out of Sinnoh. And yet, the game is good. And the game is good, and I mean this unironically. Like, I just made what sounded like a massive criticism, but it is an unironically good game. And the reason it is good is they put in place in the game. The way that you play through the game is genuinely fun. So it's weird. One thing too is that you see this a lot. It's very, the world has always been like this type reprogramming. People go, oh, well, I don't go to Pokemon for the graphics, right? And that's true, right? You don't. However, it is absolutely wrong, and it is like it's revisionist history to say that the Pokemon games have never looked good. That is not true. Like, for the system that they were on, in the past, the Pokemon games have sometimes looked very, very good. For example, the Generation 6 games, which was when the games made their transition to 3D, considering the era that those games came out in and the system that they came out on, the Nintendo DS, the game looked really, really good. Like, it's sort of a version, that same version of like revisionist history where you go, oh, the world has always been like this. You know, like it's never been better than this. Where people would go, oh, Pokemon, you never play Pokemon for the graphics. Well, no, I didn't play Pokemon specifically for the graphics, but at the same time, past Pokemon games have not looked bad.
Right.
That is a new phenomenon. The fact that Pokemon games don't look good is a recent thing. It's not something that is like endemic to the series. There's no reason it needs to be that way. It's that way because Game Freak chose to make it that way. But, at the same time, like, will I be getting the next game? I mean, I think so. And the reason for that is there is a difference between, this person has insulted me, hates me, and everything I stand for, and this company made a game that I think was a little disappointing, right? Like, Game Freak has not yet hit the threshold for me of I'm never going to give them money ever again. This is shameful. Like Naughty Dog probably has. I'm not sure if I'd ever get a Naughty Dog game again. At the very least, they're on the border. Last of Us 2 is pretty pretty nasty game. What is your take on that idea?
So, so, so I'm playing Scorn, right? And I just went through a bunch of puzzles to pull down a guy from this weird like pod thing and put him on a chair, and then I wielded this chair, rolled this chair around, where various things caused him to scream in pain as I was doing it to him, and it ended with him being scooped out of his little pod. This other guy, leaving behind one arm, which. Um, Leaving behind one arm, which I have to activate a key with. Like, you have to understand how surreal this is. You know, I just murdered a pod person, uh, for his arm, when I could have probably just, ripped it off him or something. I don't know. It just kind of feels weird. It feels weird. But I'm pretty okay with it. And now I'm carrying around this arm, and I have to get the little key thing that my own hand has, not the secondary hand that I ripped off a weird pod person. And I don't know. I basically know where. I can't remember where it is, but I know it's in one of these side hallways. And yeah, no, it's pretty horrible. It's fantastic. Um, it's exactly what I needed out of my Biopunk game. I mean, like, think about it. You basically grow a person and do things to them you can't understand, so their arm, is usable for exactly one puzzle. And I want to remind you that this person was screaming the entire time.
So, would you say that this is an example of good game design?
Mm, so I'm going to say it like this. Because I hesitated, I have to say no. However, I am enjoying the puzzles. And this is basically what I came in for. Do I understand it? No, not particularly. But I like it. And this is my jam. I'm comfortable in my jam. I'm now going to stick the arm, which now has a key attached to it, uh, into the. Just leave the arm there. Okay. Into the door, which is now going to open because I'm going to unlock it. And I'm going to leave my arm that I ripped off of a pod person who may have been sentient. And just kind of go on my way. I'm not even sure if it counts as murder.
Not even sure if it counts as murder.
Not even sure. Like, was this person bred to be a key? Like, is the screaming just an unnecessary part of it that some madman added to it for no other reason than, having a sentient key would be kind of funny?
It is kind of funny.
I mean, it's like this one guy who grows extra fingers just so that, he can be a sentient fingerprint scanner. And then you chop off a finger for the fingerprint scanner every time. And it hurts them just the same because it's a finger and it's all the nerves and the nerve endings. Gross. Gross. And, now I'm in piles of bodies. Weird piles of bodies. I apologize for some of those images. I didn't realize some of them were male and female. And it was just a tube of bodies. just pouring out of a thing that looks like a heart as graphics pop in because my computer is choking on this thing. I am not regretting a single moment I'm playing it. Hello, Fiona Wolf. Back from vacation. But the driving always causes a feeling of jet lag. New Alien game? Yes, it is inspired by H.R. Geiger. And let's be real, if Pokemon was in the Alien universe, somebody would catch it and tame it.
Yep.
Some 10-year-old freak would capture and tame the alien. I don't know. But, it's inspired.
I've always had an idea of creating an isekai that was in a Pokemon-inspired MMO.
Disgusting. Maybe if I had chosen a kinder path while realizing it, I might have saved the gentleman and not used his arm as a key, and instead brought him with me. I don't know. I'm thinking about that sentient key hand.
Thinking about that sentient key hand.
There's no context.
Well, yeah, the whole reason that I brought up Pokemon was to add on to the discussion of corporate game design in the modern day. Like,
I mean, that's all over the place.
The idea that what was that?
But that's like a normal thing, like corporate game design.
Well, the idea that I was trying to get at was that I don't think that they started out as a company that was entirely concerned with nothing but the bottom line, but I do think that is what they turned into.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's like
and I am hopeful. So being concerned with the bottom line has its perks and has its downsides. I am hopeful that maybe pressure from the last game will make it so that the next game is better. But who knows? I don't.
I don't either. I haven't played a Pokemon game since Silver.
You should get the new one. It has multiplayer co-op.
What's in it for me?
Multiplayer co-op.
Hold on, there's this weird floaty thing. And I feel like it's going to involve some sort of murder. Because it just is going to absorb into something.
Feel. Got that murdery feel.
No, it just kind of sucked in a pod thing. And there's a glowing hole that appeared. And I'm injecting the pod thing into the hole. And I'm wondering how much should I be censoring this thing? I don't know.
I can't help you answer that question. That is a question you're gonna have to answer yourself.
I'm just asking that, the keys don't scream like they do in the when I inject my fingers into other holes to control the apparati, that it doesn't make me feel skeevy.
Well, in other news, because I'm tapped out of the video game discussion, which, remember, this has been we didn't pre-plan this conversation, so yeah. So I'm tapped out of the video game discussion. In other news, have you watched anything of the new completely stacked anime season?
Yeah, Chainsaw Man, Spy X Family. Yeah, that's it.
Wait, what did you watch before that?
Chainsaw Man.
Oh, Chainsaw Man. Okay.
Okay, it's back again. What is it?
Where is the Spy Family anime at currently? Because I'm caught up on the manga. At least I think I'm caught up. If a new chapter didn't come out.
They just picked up Bond.
On what?
They just picked up the dog.
Oh, they just got Bond?
Yep.
That's the name of the dog.
Yeah.
I love it. I love the premise of Spy Family. It's just so smart. The idea that everybody in the family has some sort of bizarre and dangerous secret, and the only one who knows everything going on is Anya.
Right.
But Anya is, of course, a 5-year-old girl, so like can't actually 4 or 5, so she can't actually do anything about it.
Yeah.
It's very amusing to me.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty good. I enjoy it. I enjoy the animation. The music's pretty nice. It seems like it's a faithful adaptation. Um,
From the episodes I've seen like 5 or 6, so not none. It is a very faithful adaptation, and the additions and changes that they have made have enhanced the show rather than detracted from it.
yeah. Like I, yeah, and I'm seeing that a couple recently in this season anyway. That the stuff I have been seeing, like when they have made changes, um, they've been pretty worthwhile. Like people are like, oh, but they cut the muscle demon section from Chainsaw Man, and it's like, the muscle demon section was bad. It didn't need to be in there.
Ooh, that's kind of a hot take.
It was always bad to me. Like it's one of those things where like it didn't do anything. It just countered. It just made the main character feel like more special. Perhaps a little too special, if you get me. Like it's
I
like,
got Chet.
and it didn't really do anything. The characters never showed up again. Nothing was. Oh, there's the corpse file.
Incidentally, did you read? Here's something that might be worth discussing. Fujimoto's new one shot.
No, you keep mentioning it. I don't see any record of it.
All right, then I read it, so I know it exists.
What's it about?
I'm looking it up.
The thing with like video games and horror is that a lot of it is like kind of like cooking something very difficult. You have to treat it delicately. And the thing is that like this isn't very scary to me. It's grotesque. You know, walking by the body piles again. Uh, you know, and hearing the groans and the squelches of a strange, unknowable machine that is, you know, living as much as it is, as much as it is an inanimate object. You know, there are things that are connected to each other, that you know are connected to each other, but you can't really find a good answer for them because of how it's set up. Like, there's no reason for it to look like this, but they do. They do, and it's gross. They should hide their shame. They should hide their shame. But you kind of go into it, and it's like, yeah, all right, I dig it. The thing with like horror in video games is that there are very few that do it well. Um, you know, this is actually pretty nice if you get grossed out by this stuff. But
By
Dead
the way, I
Space.
found the manga.
What's the name of it?
Look back.
Uh, Fiona Wolf collect Corpies. Corpo game design, how to milk it to death. Good doggo. They have extra power or skill. Such elegance. Not send me a link on Discord.
All right, I will. Yeah, it's called Look Back, and it is about a girl uh, who has a talent for drawing manga that she publishes in the school newspaper. Uh, and like she's actually not that great, but like for her age, she's pretty good. And then
Mm.
she gets humiliated when somebody who doesn't even go to the school, but like is a shut-in and does everything from his home, starts submitting stuff to the school paper, and it's like actually amazing. So He plans to just give up because this person is clearly Fujino is clearly better than her, but then she is tasked with delivering this person's diploma to her. But when she does, the girl reveals that the reason that she draws and submits her manga is that she is a huge fan of hers and she like idolizes her. So she takes up drawing again, and then they eventually partner up to make manga. And I'll stop there because after that, it's getting into twist territory. But it's very good. I'll link it to you. Look back, Fujimoto. Jump.
One of the video games that is hello, that is pretty scary is Dead Space and Dead Space 2. Both of them do it right. And I think a lot of people kind of don't get how good they had it with those two, because they got the music right, they got the things right, they got the pacing right, and you can't always say that those things are available for somebody to use. Now I've got a piercer. What can I do with something that is directly designed to penetrate? I will be sending my penetrator to penetrate many different things. Disgusting. Why can't they just keep this stuff to themselves?
Sorry, I got distracted by something, but yes. Anyway, yeah, I have no commentary really on horror video games because the only ones that I've played are Bioshock. And I tried to play System Shock 2 and wasn't a big fan of the gameplay aspect of it. And as far as I can recall, that's it. I did play some of Limbo, which is sort of a horror game, I guess.
The best part about...
Do you remember Limbo?
No, I never played it. Or I didn't finish it. I don't think... I just killed something, maybe. What's going on? Oh, they're hunting me, kind of. I did try to play it, but unfortunately will it hurt me? Yes. But unfortunately, it just never worked on my PC. But quite frankly, it's like, it's kind of like one of those, I think it was Yahtzee or somebody who said something like, big-headed children in a scary shadow world, is just kind of like clickbait to some people. Maybe not clickbait, like it's like catnip. Like,
I suppose. I mean, my issue with Limbo, to be honest with you, is that eventually I just got bored with it. And in theory, I shouldn't, because, I love, like, the Portal games are my favorite games ever. They still are to this day. Nothing's ever topped Portal 1 and Portal 2 for me. So, that's not really... So the sort of the style of gameplay of Limbo, that puzzle style gameplay, should have been up my alley, and I got bored. Like, I think I got stuck on a puzzle for too long, and I said I'm no longer having fun trying to figure this out, so I give up. And I just stopped. Did the same thing with Braid, which was also like a critically acclaimed game, not a horror game, but if you remember, it was this very critically acclaimed game that used like time travel as a mechanic.
yeah.
And it was a similar like puzzle game, and I had the same thing happen Like, I was convinced I was going to be super into it and it would be one of my favorite games, and eventually I just got bored and I never
Yeah.
ended up finishing it. It was a big disappointment. Limbo was kind of on that list.
And then it's like super boring. Oh, you were the bad guy after all. And it's like,
Yeah,
shut up.
I heard the ending of Braid. It's just boring to me. Yeah, it's not as clever as it thinks it is.
Turns out you're a
Uh,
psycho stalker for some reason, and it's like, but that's
hmm
never been a thing.
Whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. Meanwhile, the Portal games hold up to this day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I've played any other horror games. No, the only horror game that I finished is original BioShock, I think.
There's a
Can't think
scene.
of any other.
There's a couple scenes in Dead Space 2 that just like blow the first one out of the water, including one where you stick a needle into your own eye to get rid of a parasite that's a necromorph that's taking you over. And then there's another one where you're in a cathedral, and there's been a lot of tense build up, and there's these velociraptor things with hard heads that are just like kind of peeking around the corner, staring at you. The first time I played through Dead Space 2, I actually stopped at that location. Like I couldn't. I had to go to bed. Like I've been playing it a very long time, and now I just was like, nope, can't do it. This is too spicy for Ben Wheeler for some reason. No clue why. Just too spicy. It was pretty scary. And the thing is that it was a big mix of things, not just like one little piece here, one little piece there. The music was on point. The visuals were on point. The tension and pace were on point. Like it was all there.
Uh, I will give you one other thing. I didn't play the game, and I have no interest in playing it, but I did watch a full Let's Play of the video game Soma, because I had heard that it had a great story, and you know what? It did. It was really cool. I got to admit. Do you know anything about Soma?
Nope.
So, you actually might be interested in it. First, by the way, I want to say for the record, and because this amuses me, the Let's Play I watched was a cryotic Let's Play. This was, of course, before I learned that he was an actual pedophile,
Duh.
and this was a real scandal that actually broke out and tanked his career. I did not know this at the time, uh, but it was a good Let's Play, so there's that. Anyway, it adds an extra layer of horror to the whole story, so I thought I'd mention it. No, but the plot of Soma is that you are like some guy. I forget exactly what your role is. Doesn't matter. And you wake up sometime. There's an accident, and you get brain damage, and you wake up sometime in the very far future in an underwater research station, and you learn that all of humanity has basically gone extinct. And you are not a human. You are a robot. Your brain has been downloaded into like a robot body. And you are being led around this research station by another robot. Uh, yeah, Fiona Wolf says the ending for Soma was paradoxically uplifting and oh my goodness. I would honestly not even classify it as uplifting, just creepy. But not in a bad way. Like, I think it asks genuinely interesting questions. The plot of Soma is that because humanity has gone extinct, there might be a way to salvage some of the human minds that are left. Like, I think the idea is that there is I forget exactly what it was, but it's on a computer somewhere, and if you can, you might be able to like download the human minds from that computer onto a satellite that you can then shoot into space so that it will survive indefinitely. I forget why it needed to be sent into space. It had a good reason. Like, the plot, like, I say this just to emphasize the plot did make sense. I just don't remember it very well. Uh, but the plot itself actually, like, it was a sensical plot. So, what made the game interesting, though, was the questions of identity that it was raising. Like, for example, in one of the honestly creepiest moments I have ever seen in any video game, the AI says, okay, so what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to download your brain into this new body that can go out into the water. And then you're going to need to come back and come back to the old body. So, right, that's fine. But then when you do that, you come back and you realize that the AI voice was not lying to you, but misleading you. You weren't downloading your mind into the new body. You were making a copy of your mind into the new body. And your old mind is still trapped in the old body. Only now it can't move and it can't communicate with anything. So you just see yourself, like the person that you were previously playing as, there in that body, like alone, and you need to make a decision over whether or not you're going to unplug it or not. It is honestly like one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen in a video game. It was incredibly creepy. And the ending, as you know, Fiona Wolf points out, the ending is incredibly creepy. Because you succeed at the end of the game. You send the consciousnesses into space, but the AI that you're talking to, or who's not really an AI but is a downloaded human mind, implies that you are going to be on this capsule that is sent into space. Except after the capsule is sent off, nothing happens. And you realize that you're not getting sent into the capsule. A copy of your mind has been downloaded into the capsule. And you are still stuck in the space station. And also, you can't die. You're just net because you're a robot. So there is nothing you could do to kill yourself. And now you're just alone forever. The end. And that's how the game ends. Really, really good story. Really creepy. Absolutely no interest in playing it myself. Do you have any thoughts?
That sounds pretty good. Identity has never really been a big thing for me, though. In that way, it's just like, yeah, this is just me. If I merge in, I'll have the same memories and whatnot. And being a dolphin for 15 minutes isn't the same sort of verification, from being a personality. Dolphin Ben is still going to be as much of a jerk Ben as Ben is. You know, it works out.
I think the question of identity that's trying to question, though, is like the original versions of these people don't disappear. You know what I mean?
Yes. I mean,
So when you send the minds into space, the you that you've been playing as over the course of the game is still trapped.
yes. No
So
argument.
that's the horror moment of the end of the game.
Right.
And it's what Fiona Wolf is saying. Like, it depends, whether it's uplifting or not. Because on one hand, you do make it into space. Now, by the way, for the record, in real life, I would resolve the dilemma by saying that none of these copies of the human mind are humans. They are all just computer programs that are replicating humans. But that's why I don't,
Yep.
that's not a very interesting fictional premise, I suppose. It's just like, no, humanity's extinct. These are all computers. There is no moral value to any of them.
It's computers all the way down. Yeah. Flesh puppets of Ben Wheeler might still be Ben Wheeler, but that doesn't mean that we'd agree. Cause,
Doesn't mean you necessarily agree on everything.
right,
Well,
especially
right, but
since
that's the thing. That's the whole teleportation dilemma, right? Where they go, oh, it's just a copy of you. But the whole thing kind of falls apart when you say, uh, okay, but what if the original version isn't destroyed?
yep.
Well, then it's much more obvious that it's not teleportation.
And like it's one of those things where it's like there's a certain amount of random chance. Yeah, for the first like 15, 20 minutes, me and Ben too are going to think the same things. But like after that time, it gets progressively faster and faster. I mean, sorry, more likely again and again and again that we're going to start disagreeing with each other. And you know, not because of anything particularly that's changed in me, but the fact is that I don't keep a thought straight for 15 minutes. And then when I think about something else at random, it's basically something else at random. It's not, you know, some sort of reasonable, logical boo boo doo 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 boo doo, you know, one after another. You know, and all people are like this in their own way. Expecting consistency from your teleporter clone is a fool's errand.
Right. The idea, yeah, that's the thing. That's why teleportation is not, what we quote unquote teleportation is not teleportation, right?
Right.
It's cloning.
Yep.
And with that, we hit 9 o'clock. This was a very stream of consciousness type of stream. I guess we'll try and be more organized next week. But, I'm okay with that sort of stream every now and then. Hopefully, our viewers won't hate it.
Yeah, we talked about a lot, and that's
We
kind of
did.
the goal. Plus, I'm playing this
Yep,
new
yep.
game, which is absolutely mysterious and strange. It is. It is certainly strange. It is disturbing.
Any last words before we go?
Happy Halloween, folks. I hope you enjoy. Uh, I hope you enjoy this stuff.
Halloween.
Halloween. I'm just thinking about the flesh
Happy.
puppets. Alright? The flesh puppet that I ripped the arm off for to have a key that I would use once. It was. Alright, have a good one, guys.